There's a specific kind of quiet that settles into a house after a loss. Not the quiet of an ordinary afternoon, when the cat is sleeping and the world is temporarily still. A different quality, heavier, more textured, as if the air itself has registered that something is missing. You feel it when you walk through a room that used to hold more life than it does now. And if you have a cat, you may have noticed something in those first days and weeks that you couldn't quite name. A change in them, a shift in how they moved through the house, where they chose to be, how they were with you. Maybe they started sleeping in a spot they had never particularly chosen before. A chair, a corner, a patch of floor near a door. Maybe they became quieter than usual, or louder. Maybe they followed you more closely, staying in whatever room you were in, unwilling to be far. Maybe they searched, walked through the house with a specific kind of purposeful attention, checking rooms, pausing at doorways, coming back to places they kept returning to without finding what they were looking for. What you were watching was grief. Not a human version of it, not a metaphor for it, the real thing expressed in the language available to them. Cats grieve. The evidence for this is both scientific and overwhelming in the lived experience of people who have watched it happen. They grieve the loss of other animals they lived with. They grieve the loss of people. They grieve the disruption of a world that had a particular shape and now has a different one. And the way they grieve, the specific behaviours, the duration, the physical expression of loss, tells us something about the depth of attachment that preceded it. The scientific starting point is behavioural. Studies on cats who have lost a companion animal, another cat, a dog, another species they bonded with, consistently document a recognisable pattern of responses. Appetite changes, often a decrease, sleep disruption, increased vocalisation in cats who were previously quiet, or unusual silence in cats who were previously vocal. Searching behaviour, moving through the house, investigating familiar locations, pausing at places the other animal used to occupy. Increased clinginess with the humans in the household, or in some cats, increased withdrawal. Lethargy, a general flattening of engagement with the environment that in humans we would not hesitate to call depression. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals conducted a survey of households where a cat had lost a companion animal and found that nearly 2/3 of cats showed 4 or more behavioural changes following the loss. These weren't random fluctuations. They were directional, oriented toward the loss, shaped by it, lasting in most cases for weeks to months. What this tells us is that the bond was real enough to leave a mark when it broke. Grief is not possible without attachment. You cannot mourn something that didn't matter to you. The searching behaviour alone, the repeated purposeful investigation of places associated with the lost companion, implies a mental model of that individual, an expectation of their presence that reality keeps failing to confirm. That is not instinct in the simple sense. That is memory meeting absence. Your cat is reading you constantly. Your scent, your posture, your cortisol levels, the micro expressions your face makes when you think no one is watching. They build a detailed model of everyone they live with, human and animal alike. Most owners never realise how complete that model is. I put together a guide covering exactly that layer, the signals cats send and the signals they read from you that most people never learn to recognise. It's called What Your Cat is Hiding, and the link is in the description. If you've ever felt like your cat understands you on a level you can't fully explain, that guide is going to show you why that feeling is more accurate than you think. There is a second layer to feline grief that matters even more, and it's the one that tends to go undiscussed. Cats also grieve when humans grieve, not as a mirror of human emotion, not because they have decided to be sad, because you are sad, but because they are exquisitely sensitive to the changes that grief produces in the bodies and environments of people they are bonded to. When you are grieving, your cortisol levels are elevated, your routine changes, your scent changes, The way you move through the house changes. The sounds of the house change. There are absences in the soundscape that didn't used to be there. Your body language shifts in ways you may not be aware of. The quality of your presence in a room is different. Your cat detects all of this, and research on cats and human emotional states consistently shows that cats respond to elevated stress and grief in their owners with increased proximity behavior. They move closer, stay longer, initiate contact more than they normally would. This is not simply seeking warmth or comfort for themselves. The response is targeted. It is directed specifically at the grieving person, not at other people in the household who are not grieving. They are responding to you specifically because of what they are reading from you specifically. The people who remember their cats during periods of grief often describe a pattern that is consistent enough to feel like documentation. The cat who appeared in the room they were crying in without being called. The cat who climbed onto their chest in the middle of the night and stayed there for hours, unmoving during the worst weeks. The cat who found them in the bathroom, behind the closed door, and sat outside it for the duration. The cat who, after months of moderate distance, suddenly became a presence so consistent and close that the person began to understand it as something they were being offered. Not asked for, not owed, simply offered, at the moment they needed it most. None of these cats spoke. None of them explained themselves. They arrived and they stayed, and the staying was the language. What cats do with human grief is distinct from what they do in ordinary life in one important way. They don't wait to be invited. The usual architecture of cat-human contact, where the cat decides when approach happens and on what terms, gets set aside. Something in the reading of your state overrides the usual caution, the usual assessment period, the usual independent timing. They come because you need them to, even though you didn't ask, even though they can't know that's what they're doing in any language that maps onto human understanding. They come because the signal they're reading from your body is one that requires a response. That response, uninvited, unprompted, sustained, and specifically directed at you, is one of the clearest expressions of attachment in the cat-human relationship. It is the grief response given back. They receive your loss and they answer it with presence, not with solutions, not with distraction, not with the performance of comfort. Just presence, sustained, for as long as it takes. There is something in that which deserves to be named clearly. We spend a great deal of time wondering whether cats are capable of the kind of emotional depth we attribute to dogs or to each other. The grief behavior, their own grief, and their response to ours suggests that the question was never whether they have the depth. It was whether we were paying close enough attention to see it. The cat who searched for weeks after losing their companion was not confused. They were mourning. The cat who sat outside the bathroom door during the worst night was not seeking warmth. They were attending. The difference matters because it changes what we understand about who these animals are and what the relationship between us actually holds. Grief requires love in order to exist. There is no other explanation for the searching, the changed sleep, the decreased appetite, the months of behavioral shift that follows a loss. What you are watching in a grieving cat is the evidence of what was there before, the attachment that made the absence land so heavily. And what you're receiving from a cat who comes to you in your own grief is the same thing. A creature whose bond with you is real enough that your pain becomes legible to them and worth responding to. If you have watched your cat grieve after the loss of another animal or after a loss in your household, tell me about it in the comments. What did you notice? What did they do that you still think about? I want to hear what it looked like from where you were, because I think the accumulation of those specific moments says something that deserves to be said out loud. The searching behavior is worth staying with, because it's the part that most clearly reveals what grief actually is in a cat's experience. When a cat loses a companion they have lived with, another cat, a dog, a person, and begins moving through the house, investigating their usual locations, they are not disoriented. They are not confused about the physical layout of the home. They know exactly where they're going. They are going to the places that held that individual, the spots they slept in, the routes they travelled, the locations where contact happened regularly, and they are checking whether they are there. The expectation exists, reality keeps failing to meet it, and the cat returns again because the expectation is not yet updated. This is the same structure as human grief. The reaching for a phone to send a message to someone who is gone, the automatic glance at a chair that is now empty, the moment of forgetting and the moment of remembering again. The brain has a model of the world that included that individual, and grief is the process of updating that model against overwhelming resistance. Because updating it means accepting something the self does not want to accept. Cats go through this. The timeline varies as it does in humans. Some cats' searching behaviour resolves in weeks. In others, it extends for months, particularly when the bond was long and close. There are documented cases of cats showing behavioural changes for over a year following the loss of a companion. The duration is not a measure of confusion. It is a measure of depth. One thing that emerges consistently in accounts of feline grief is how specific it is. A cat who lived with 3 other cats and loses one does not grieve all of them equally. They grieve the one they were closest to, the one they slept with, groomed with, spent the most time near. The relationship had its own particular weight, and the loss of it lands accordingly. This specificity matters because it tells us that what the cat had was not a generalized attachment to the group, but individual bonds with individual animals that were specific enough to leave individual marks when they broke. The same specificity appears in how cats respond to human grief. They do not distribute their attention evenly among everyone in the household. They find the person who is most affected. They arrive in that room, not another one. They stay with that person, not another one. The reading is precise. The response is targeted. This is not random comfort-seeking behaviour. This is a creature who has built such a detailed model of the people they live with that they can detect from across the house who needs them most. That level of attunement, the ability to read individual emotional states, to distinguish between a person who is fine and a person who is not, to direct care toward the one who needs it without being asked, is not something we typically associate with cats, but it is what the behaviour shows. Again and again, in household after household, in circumstances too varied and too specific to be coincidence, they are paying attention. They have always been paying attention. Grief just makes it visible in a way that ordinary life doesn't. If you have been there for your cat's grief, or if your cat has been there for yours, tell me about it in the comments. Describe what you saw or what you received. What did it look like? How long did it last? What do you still think about when you think about that time? I want to hear it, because I think what you describe will say something about these animals that we don't say often enough, and that deserves to be heard. There's one more thing worth naming, and it's the hardest one to talk about. Some cats know before the loss happens. People who have cared for dying animals, or who have lost people at home, in hospice, in the long final weeks, describe their cats changing before the death occurred, becoming quieter, spending more time near the person or animal who was dying, arriving and staying in a way that felt different from ordinary presence, as if something in them had already registered what was coming and decided that presence was the response. Whether this is detection of physical change, the altered scent of a body in decline, the changed rhythm of breathing, the shift in cortisol and other markers that a dying body produces, or something less easily named, what these cats were doing was attending. They arrived before they were needed, and they stayed through what came after. The grief in these cases seems to have begun before the loss and continued through it, and the presence they offered in both directions, before and after, is the same thing. A creature whose bond was real enough that the ending of it was something they felt, and something they answered with their body, and their time, and their staying. That is not a small thing. It has never been a small thing. We just didn't always have the language to say what it was.